All right, as today's topic is extremely specialized, we're not expecting a big crowd, so I think we're probably good to get going, and everyone else can kind of filter in as needed. Thank you so much again for joining. I'm Michelle Bodian, one of the partners here at Vicente, Connecticut, born and raised, and heading up all of our licensing, regulatory, and compliance efforts, along with my colleague Casey Lever, who I'll have introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Casey Lever. I'm our Director of Regulatory Compliance, covering the Northeast here. I'm also a lead for Connecticut for compliance and spent some time boots on the ground in Connecticut going through some of the inspection process. So we're going to share with you today some of the important things about compliance and what we've learned so far with working with DCP.
And just quick reminder, those of you who wandered in here unfamiliar with the law firm, I'm sure there aren't many of you, but national cannabis and psychedelics focused law firm started about more than a decade ago out of Denver. Our founders working on Amendment 64, which is the legalization effort there. And then we've got about 8 offices nationally. Our Connecticut office is remote, unfortunately. I'm still fighting the good fight to get an in-person office there, but hasn't stopped us from doing plenty of work, both with the medical operators, pre-adult use, and then in the existing adult use market. Next slide. All right, quick run of show of what we're hoping to accomplish today. So best practices and compliance tips, when we're kind of stretching compliance as well as application compliance. So some final license tips and tricks, as well as what to expect during some of these facility inspections, how to draft compliant SOPs, and then great, you're up and running, final, good to go. What are some of these ongoing compliance responsibilities? And then just kind of have some pain points and some tips and tricks of what we've seen in this market over the past few years. All right, so Connecticut, where to go to figure out what you're supposed to do. We've got a number of laws, and this isn't even counting the previous medical ones, but it's a patchwork of figuring out what is in effect, how it impacts your business. Obviously, legislative sessions, they're impacting it at a session right now, but everyone's gearing up for what's going to happen, come back in January. We do have a number of acts over the years that have impacted this market, as well as how everyone, I hope, here is aware Connecticut operates under policies and procedures. These do have the force and effect of essentially regulations, shorthand PNPs there, and they must be posted 15 days before their effective date. So they'll come up on the e-regs website, it's just online. You'll notice, see them there and say, they'll be effective 14 days later. So for me personally, before I do anything, answer any questions, I always check the e-regulation site to make sure there isn't a latest and greatest that have been published there to make sure I have the latest information. PNPs can't be effective forever. They'll actually sunset, at which point a DCP has to adopt final regulations, and those are valid, the PNPs, until the agency adopts final regulations, or 48 months from when the original Public Act 21-1 was passed. So we can have PNPs essentially up to June 22nd, 2025. So we've still got a bit more time. If there's any tweaks you need in the policies and procedures, now would be the time to speak up, talk to DCP, because once they're locked into regulations, a little bit harder to make any changes. Next slide. All right, kicking it over to you, Casey, to take over the next few.
So the final license requirements, we're just going to go through some of few things that you need to get your final license. First being the property documentation, including your right to occupy and blueprints. We're going to go into further detail a little bit further into the webinar about some of the floor plan requirements and what you should expect, where you should be with those floor plans as you kind of progress through the inspection process. You'll also need a workforce development plan approved by the SEC, a social equity plan approved by the SEC, security plans, policies for preventing diversion and misuse of cannabis, a labor peace agreement, and a seed to sale contract. Now for the seed to sale contract, that is not something that you can have the contract in place, but you're not actually going to have access to the seed to sale tracking system until the final license has been issued. Next slide. These are some of the final license must-haves and tips for property. So the first thing you've got to do, of course, is identify the location that's appropriate, or is appropriately zoned for cannabis use, which is not obviously the easiest thing all the time to find that location. Then you've got to obtain your special permit and any other applicable local permits. Now, once you've got that down, you've got the location, you've gone through any special permit process or any local requirements, you will then notify DCP of the address via the form. There's an online form that's fillable that you can, let DCP know this is the address. I'm prepared for an inspection, which we're going to go through again further in this webinar. But you're ready for an inspection, or you're not. You're just sharing the address, letting them know that you have confirmed that location. Now, DCP has been reaching out to licensees to say, please let us know when you've identified the address, and what they're trying to do is essentially identify which of their agents is going to be associated with your license and kind of spread their areas out based on jurisdiction. So if you have had a DCP agent also reach out, in addition to the form, you want to make sure that you email the individual back and let them know this is the address and I've completed the form. And lastly, for your property, and probably the most important, is to prepare comprehensive floor plans. And those floor plans should include the vault specifications and a security overlay. DCP typically will not schedule the inspection until you have those floor plans. And if you think about it, that's super important, because if they're going to come boots on the ground and actually be on site, they're going to want to know what your plans are. And honestly, you should know too, so nobody really wastes each other's time. And we're going to get into, again, some of the requirements for the vault, but on those floor plans, you do want to acknowledge that you have a full understanding of the vault requirements for Connecticut, which are different than what we see in other states. They're quite extensive. They are more in line with like the DEA typical requirements for a controlled substance storage.
And just to clarify, this is our recommendation of steps. There's certainly nothing preventing you from providing an address to DCP today, even if you don't have that special use permit. Ideally, you do at least have site control, whether that's a letter of intent, a lease, a purchase agreement, whatever it is. But DCP doesn't have a hard and fast rule, either in the PNPs of law, of when you contact them. That's just our recommendation, so as not essentially not to waste DCP staff time. They're sorted regionally. So if you provide one property, you're getting to know an agent. They've mentally checked, okay, this region has this number of properties versus that, so as to not to overburden them. And then, worst case scenario, you don't get that use permit. You have to go find another property, or negotiations break down with your landlord, whatever it is. We just recommend waiting to get a little further along in the process before officially notifying DCP. But choose your own adventure on that one. No requirement. There's no hard and fast rule. Next slide. While I'm talking, I'll keep talking about labor peace agreements. So this is a condition of final license, and just want to flag that this is a change in law from over the summer. I mentioned one of those laws. So currently there's one definition of bona fide labor organization, and that definition is going to change as of October 1st. And essentially, in order to be considered a bona fide labor organization after that date, these labor unions will need to be registered with DCP. And on the next slide, there's a list of what the criteria are for the unions to qualify. There's going to be an application process. No later than September, DCP should open up applications for inclusion on the list. And then here's the qualification. So just something to keep in mind as people are going through the provisional to final license process right now, and they're looking at unions, trying to determine who to negotiate with, who's active in the market. You might want to consider either strongly suggesting or requiring your labor union who you've been talking with to make sure they fill out the form and get on the list, so that you have no issues, no problems there. And then just something else to flag. So you're not required to upload a copy of your labor peace agreement, but you are required to upload into the portal as a condition of final license your attestation that you do have a labor peace agreement, and DCP's actually put out a form. And that form, that attestation, would be signed by you, the licensee, as well as by the labor union itself. So just want to make sure people are aware of this upcoming change and keeping track. And then last check, I think as of recently, so far it looks like 2 of the medical now converted to adult use production facilities are now unionized. So as far as I'm aware, those are the only 2 so far in the state. Next slide.
All right. Another must-have is your workforce development and social equity plans. Both plans are subject to approval by the Social Equity Council. The Social Equity Council has actually published rubrics and criteria right on DCP's website, so you can go through as you're developing your plans, make sure you're checking all the boxes and have a full understanding of the way that SEC is viewing these plans. There's also a social equity plan technical assistance document that kind of walks you through developing your social equity plan based on the criteria. Now, the purpose again is to help social equity licensees in developing the social equity plan and making sure that it meets the criteria established by the SEC. Next slide.
And I would just jump in there. There's SEC has its own web pages hosted by DCP, and then DCP has its own web pages. I would just caution to check SEC's web page, and under the news and events is where you'd find the latest and greatest information on the rubrics. There's been a couple changes, and it doesn't look like DCP's site has quite updated. So if you want to see the latest with some minor tweaks, go to the SEC's website, and then they have that news and announcements pages. You scroll down and you'll find the information there.
Yeah, and it's certainly important to get your workforce development plan, your social equity plans submitted as soon as possible in the event that you are trying to commence operations and get your doors open soon. You do have to get those plans approved, so the sooner you have those developed, the better position you're going to be in to stay on track with your own timelines. Important things about the social equity plan specifically is that the goals must be measurable. So as you're developing your plans, you don't want to speak so broadly that it's not something that when you come to a 6-month progress report or an annual report, as you can see on the slide, is required. You're unable to say that, you've made progress towards a goal or you've met a goal because there is no exact measurement. And the SEC will be looking for that as they're reviewing these plans. You also have to include a process for receiving feedback from stakeholders and from internally from your own company, whether that's employee involvement, different types of internal meetings to kind of make sure that as a company, everybody understands what your goals are and everybody can be a part of providing feedback and making sure that you've made progress towards those plans. Another part of the social equity plans is, if you're starting to develop yours now, is you also have a commitment to purchasing goods and services from businesses located in DIAs or businesses registered as MBEs in the state of Connecticut. So again, spend a lot of time, really think about your plans, think about what the measurements are going to be. Don't overcommit. You do have to put the 6-month progress report in, as well as an annual report, which is going to be required for your license renewal. I can't say again that it's really just important that you've drilled down and thought about what the measurements actually going to be, what they're going to be, and what type of metrics you're going to collect throughout the year to demonstrate compliance with your plans. Next slide. Okay, now to the fun stuff, the facility inspections. So as of right now, and again, DCP may, change the way this goes, and it's really what I can say, just generally speaking about working with DCP and in other states with different agencies, is they have a plan for inspections that is very collaborative with licensees. You're able to get feedback from your agent, and you should really be transparent, and very open and communicative with the agent that you're assigned to, because they're going to be with you throughout this entire process. Right now, the build inspections are required at 0%, 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100%. So you're going to be seeing your agent as your building actually comes together. Inspections are scheduled based on the DCP agent's availability and maybe around 2 weeks from request. So you want to, as you're developing your timeline for build out, work in when that communication is going to be going out to your your agent to make sure that everything moves on your timeline. And I'll tell you that, the DCP agents are not there to get in your way. They are certainly extremely responsive and again, ready to work with you as you are working through this process. So 0% inspection. This is basically request once you have floor plans prepared. This is the initial inspection, bare bones of the facility prior to build out. If you've got a facility that, maybe needs some reno, or you're going to knock it down, you may want to communicate with your DCP agent about when they want the 0%, if they want it when everything has been demoed, or if they want to see it prior to demo. Just again, transparent communication. Every agent will kind of guide you about when they would like to see the facility and when they want to come in next. At these inspections, DCP will provide feedback on the proposed plans and security requirements. And once you've worked through those, you can submit revised floor plans and security plans based on their feedback. And after you've kind of revised those, you're going to want to talk to DCP and ideally, speak to them in writing about what they need to make sure that your next step and your next part of this build out is compliant and is, fits what their expectations are for the next portion of the inspection. Next slide. Next is a 25% inspection. And this is typically when, again, totally take the advice of your DCP agent and be in complete communication with them as they go through, because they will tell you, okay, call me in at this phase, or, next, once you've revised the floor plans, reach out and let us know. But again, typically the 25% inspection is called in when the walls are framed out, or otherwise communicated by your DCP agent. When you have this 25%, you're going to need to leave the vault material exposed for inspection. If you already have a vault in place, let's say, it's a bank or something that already had a pretty substantial vault in place, you will need to do a core sample or somehow evidence that the materials that the vault is made of meet DCP's requirements for a vault. Very important. The vault is a big focus of the inspections. And what you don't want to do is be in a position where you have either completely, finish the vault build out or walled it in or something where, coring it could cause a problem. So keep in mind as you go through, that vault material is super important. Once, you're going to take the cue from your DCP agent about when you're going to request your 50% inspection, but it's, 50% halfway through your build out. Once you get halfway through, 75% is likely when the security systems are installed or at minimum wired, because what you're going to want to make sure you're also in a position for the 100% is to make the changes that DCP needs to make sure your security systems are compliant and meet the requirements. And lastly, you're looking at the 100% inspection when build out is complete and the site is prepared to receive cannabis products. All right, next slide.
Before you move on, I just wanted to jump in. Currently, based on what we're seeing, DCP agents are scheduling about 2 to 3 weeks out, but obviously August, summer vacation, September, ramping up for fall, a lot of agents' kids and my kids included going back to school. So just something to keep in mind. You don't want to call for an inspection too soon and have to push and delay, but you also want to make sure you leave yourself enough buffer time that they're able to schedule and accommodate around when you need to be there and be on site. Sorry to cut you off, Casey.
No, great point. So some of the considerations for your facility inspection is the delivery. You are going to want to go through and be able to articulate how you're going to be receiving cannabis products. And when you do receive cannabis products, what you cannot do is have it come through, the customer entrance. In many states, you're able to kind of shut down operations and clear the sales floor and allow the delivery to come in. You may also be allowed to receive deliveries during off hours, but deliveries must be random. To accommodate that, you can't necessarily say, okay, well, you can't get any deliveries during the day because that's essentially not random. So you want to think about where these deliveries are coming in and that they're coming into a secure area like a designated delivery man trap or a back of house restricted area. Think about visibility. Visibility from the exterior. Is it film, some type of tint? Visibility into secure areas. So if I'm in the point of sale area, what do I see? What can I see into? You don't want to have visibility into those secure areas. Certainly, it can be considered a security issue and also something that DCP doesn't want to see. Vault construction and cannabis storage. Vaults in Connecticut have to be at least 8 inches of reinforced concrete or other substantial masonry reinforced vertically and horizontally with a 1/2 inch steel rod, tied 6 inches on the center. I'm not going to read the whole thing out. But yes, this is walls, floors, and ceilings have to be constructed of that. You have to have multiple position combination lock. The GSA class 5 rated steel door actually meets all of those qualifications. This is one of the 7 qualifications, so I'm not going to go through all of them. It also includes a day gate. So the vault construction and those materials, there are very strict requirements on those. So you need to familiarize yourself with that, make sure your construction team is aware of what those requirements are. And that may mean, finding a specialized construction team that's able to prepare this vault for you in a manner that meets these requirements. But certainly something, as soon as you bring DCP in there, you should be aware of where that vault's going and how you're going to actually construct that.
How does this compare? Yeah, sorry, you saw me going.
I do it.
I had my own point, but I wanted to just ask first. I know you operate in multiple markets. How does this compare against other states in terms of vault specs?
This is probably one of the most comprehensive vault specs that I've seen that is specifically laid out in regulation. There are many states that it's kind of subjective. It's not written anywhere. It's really up to the regulatory body or the investigator to determine that it's compliant. And what we see in those states is typically just steel wire mesh reinforcement. They don't even necessarily need to see a core sample. That's not always the case and is somewhat rare that they ask you to prove it, basically. Some states, again, they don't even require that. What I do actually find is the requirement often comes from the insurance company, because some insurance companies will say, well, we're not going to insure these products stored in a vault that doesn't meet our requirements, and their requirements may be more on par with the DEA cage or DEA requirements. So yes, certainly a lot more, detailed. I personally like detail because it gives you more of a play-by-play versus, assuming everything's okay. I'd rather have somebody say this is exactly what I need and check it off the list. So it's definitely more comprehensive. I like it.
Yeah, fair. And then, 2 points to add there. One, you can get ready-made prefabricated vaults. I'm not cool enough to say prefab. Sorry, I realized that mid use of the word. Prefabricated vaults, and in which case DCP is going to want to see those specs from the company, and obviously make sure if you're going with a national vault company, someone unfamiliar with the specs, send them the specs to make sure it actually complies. And then all the core sampling Casey's talking about, that's if you're looking to construct it yourself. And then I was hoping, Casey, I think we should touch on a little bit why the size of the vault is so relevant. Maybe you're going to get to this later, but hyper focused on the construction and the safety aspects of it. But as people are starting to think about how and where they're placing their vault, big, small, medium size, what are we seeing in terms of what's a good size? And why might you want it to be large for your first build?
Great point. So you want it to be large enough to store all cannabis products overnight. Everything that you may bring out to a fulfillment area or a locked secured storage area that you fulfill from the day, it has to live at night in the vault. And I can tell you the biggest regret I've experienced from, working in this industry is that my vault was too small. And sometimes it's too late. That may mean you have to, you're going to have to go through a structural change to get a larger vault, or, implement other storage. And as you can see, we are very focused in Connecticut about this vault construction. So if you build this out small on the first time, you are going to go through this all over again and have to rebuild should you determine once you're operational, this doesn't work. If you have a very small vault and it's existing, you may be in a situation where you're going to have to do very strategic ordering. Sometimes it's not in your control. If you're not vertical, this may not be something you're able to say, I can, get exactly this amount of product that I need on this date. So I'm of the opinion, the bigger, the better. You do need to at least consider that every cannabis product is going back into that vault at night. So good point, Michelle. That vault, bigger, the better.
In conclusion.
Yes, that's to sum it up. And that's kind of speaks to cannabis storage, right? Cannabis has to be stored and, in a secured area during the day, like a day amount could basically come out and be stored in a locked cabinet. So you want to make
retail and hybrid retail.
On the retail, correct. That's correct. Now you're obviously not going to see that as much with your manufacturing or cultivation. That's not really the case, but on the retail side, you know, remember, you can have a day amount out, but it needs to be in a locked and secured cabinet. These are all things, again, with these facility inspections, you're going to work through all of this with your DCP agent as you build out. And remember, you can't just up and change your mind about where this is going to go once you're halfway through. Not necessarily halfway through the inspections, because you might still have time to do that then, but should you change anything about your operations, if you're currently operational and you're talking about cannabis storage, you need to talk to your DCP agent and provide any materials as requested, update SOPs, and get their approval before changing anything along the lines of cannabis storage. Speaking of cannabis storage, undeliverable cannabis. So for retail and hybrid retail, there's a requirement to have an undeliverable, you know, cannabis storage container. It needs to be on the accessible from the exterior, and it needs to go into a, you know, restricted area. So for example, where it couldn't go is in your entry vestibule, right? That's just going right to the entry vestibule. It has to be accessible from the exterior. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to set it up where someone would have to walk into your entry vestibule or walk into the sales floor to drop it off. The point being that if somebody's out for delivery and the facility is closed, they need to be able to drop that cannabis back off and know it is secured and being securely stored overnight. So think about that as you're putting your plans together as well. Where is that undeliverable cannabis box gonna go? And electronic access control. So you want all your secured areas to be secure with electronic access control. So that way you can monitor the movement throughout the activity. Throughout the premises, the activity throughout the premises. Cultivators and manufacturers, packagers actually have an explicit requirement to maintain a log of that movement, which we'll discuss, I think, further into the webinar as well. But that electronic access control is, you know, a huge piece of monitoring movement, and it's, you know, best practice for any state to use electronic access control. Not the cheapest way, but, you know, the most effective and definitely security best practice. And now you got multi-tenant units. Another thing is you're thinking about, like, where's my facility going to go? How am I going to build this out? If you share a wall, a demising wall, it can't just be drywall. It's going to need to be reinforced. The concern being that somebody from the other tenant can access the premises. You're going to want to think about basements. You're going to want to think about, you know, if you're on the first floor and somebody's on the second floor, how are you securing the premises? And these are all things that get discussed through this 0% to 100% inspections. All right, next slide.
All right, I think this is me, but with heavy participation from Casey. So, you know, as condition of final license, but also as a condition of operating as a responsible and reasonable cannabis establishment, you want to make sure you have security SOPs and diversion SOPs, and they don't have to be, you know, what we always think about as SOPs, but they have to be written policies and procedures, both for preventing diversion and misuse of cannabis and sales to underage individuals, as well as security plan and information about your security system and how you adopt and are following all the law and the policies and procedures. And while the final versions need to be uploaded into eLicense as a condition of final license. And as Casey said, these will be updated on a go-forward basis with DCP's blessing and approval. But one thing, you know, a number of agents, and obviously speak to your agent to confirm and double check anything we're saying generally today, but also specifically on this topic, you know, they're willing to review these plans, these SOPs in advance, willing to accept, you know, an email submission of saying, here's what I'm thinking. Is this meeting the rules? Get those tweaks done. You know, what they don't want to have happen with all of this, both the inspections and the SOPs reviews and the communication, they don't want you to get to the end of the process, you think you're golden, you submit it, and then it turns out the meeting of the minds was not there at all, and then you have to start all over again. They're here to help and enable, and they want you to get open as soon as you can as well. So part of this is just trying to catch issues sooner and earlier. So just double check with your agent and make sure they're comfortable with you submitting, whether it's an email or upload, however it is, to receive this and get that feedback. Next slide. All right, so how do you draft these if this is your first time drafting? There's obviously a lot of technical experts, attorneys, other people that out there can help, but at the most basic level, obviously start with the laws, start with the policies and procedures. And that's kind of the intent of showing those initial slides about making sure you know which laws are applicable and which versions of the policies and procedures. I don't want you working off the 4th edition when today we're on the 5th edition. And then I actually didn't check this morning. For all I know, we're about to be on the 6th edition. So one thing about those policies and procedures build in a lot of flexibility to get the market up and running, but it does mean you only have 2 weeks notice if there's about to be a change. So definitely make sure you're using the latest and greatest on the policies and procedures, as well as in the state has put out on DCP's websites a lot of FAQs. They've kind of slowed down in recent months, but there was one that had popped up comparatively recently talking about multi-tier grow facilities. So they are still doing it. There's free software out there. If you're interested in signing up for it, it'll scrub the web page for you and alert you anytime there's a change. That something like that can make it easier. Or you can do what I do and just obsessively check it 5 times a day. So kind of where to start from there, and then work in some of these practical implications. Casey, feel free to jump in here at any point. You want to make sure what you're saying you're going to do, you can actually do it. So if you're talking about workflow of staff or who's doing what, model it out, practice it, make sure it's actually something you're going to be able to implement. Because if you're not able to implement it and the state finds out about it, you're going to be in some hot water there.
Yeah, exactly. When you think about the practical implications, it's not just, anyone who works in the cannabis industry now knows there's regulations. The hardest part about working in compliantly in this is taking those words on a piece of paper and factor them into your day-to-day. So if you're able to flush that out in your SOPs, you're not only compliant, but that you've really thought about what the day-to-day is going to look like. So the more you can get ahead of this, you get DCP's blessing, the better position you're going to be in when you actually open your doors, or even 6 months, a year into your operation, you've already known that you're operating compliantly. So the more detail you can get in, the better. The more specifics to your operation, you'll be in a better place right from the beginning.
Yeah, and if you're doing it alone or working with others, obviously there's off-the-shelf SOPs, there's public ones available from other markets. Obviously this is obvious, but I'm going to state it anyway. You need to make sure it actually speaks to your facility, your floor plan. If you update your floor plan based upon feedback between the 25 and 50% inspection, make sure to go back in and update your SOPs. Make sure it's not a static document, that it is being updated in real time as you're making other changes. And then, throughout this inspection process, and even, post final license, continued inspections, don't worry, you're not done. You'll still work with your agent and they'll still be coming on site. If there's any special security considerations you've spoken about, HVAC, skylights, decommissioned elevators, random doors that go nowhere. We've seen it all. You want to make sure that those are specifically accounted for in SOPs. If you have a throwaway discussion in person with the agent, it's not a throwaway discussion. Follow up in writing, understand what you've agreed to verbally, get it confirmed in writing, and then make sure that gets incorporated into your SOPs.
Yeah, and what I find, there's a good point about the discussions that you have, and all of these SOPs you put into place based on discussions at the very beginning, right? When you open your doors, when you're planning and building out. What I find falls off in compliance around the 6 month, year mark is a lot of it, there's turnover, right? Naturally. But a lot of that historical knowledge on why you do something a certain way, why you don't open, the door that leads to nowhere, why this is, a specific lock, and why you have a key log, that sometimes goes away. So it's really important that you do these refreshers on your compliant SOPs and that your staff are well aware of why you're doing what you're doing, because to some people it may not make sense in the day-to-day. It may just be faster to walk through that door that they're not supposed to be walking through. And then reinforce, your SOPs. This is just compliance best practice with signage. Anybody that I've worked with before will know that I've been to a facility because there are signs when things seem intuitive, but I don't care, because the more signage you have, the more you're reinforcing your SOPs and making sure that the initial approval of some of these compliant SOPs lives on and makes it to, a year and a half later.
Yeah, and with that and that historical knowledge, be the record keeper now, understand why you built your facility, how you did it, understand the limitations, understand DCP's opinion. Obviously, this can change. There could be changes in laws, change in PNPs. We can get regulations, so I can stop saying PNPs. A lot can change, but thanks, appreciate the laugh. Then when you go to sell your business or bring on or change of location or remodel, you want to understand how you ended up here and what the limitations are of what you can do to expand. And if Casey said, if there's staff turnover, if you're hiring a head of compliance or a key employee, they might not know why you did things a certain way. But if you know today, there's a reason you agree with DCP to build your facility in such a manner, or if you're only licensing the first floor, document that now, put it in your files, however you keep your files, so that a year from now, 5 years from now, you understand this. So, in a year or 2 years, when you go to do something different, the next person, whoever it is, or even yourself, I have a terrible memory. So, if you go look back and you can at least have, oh yeah, that is why I designed the facility that way. That's why I moved the door, because of the rules at the time, because of my preference. That's why it looks like it looks. All right, next slide.
All right. Ongoing compliance considerations. Okay, so now you're up and running. We're going to focus on this is not everything. This is not intended to be comprehensive. The PNPs, Connecticut laws, there is a lot to unpack there for ongoing compliance considerations. So this is just going to scratch the surface. Adhering to visitor registration process. Connecticut has something that I would say, less than half states do, where there's a 24-hour notification requirement to DCP. I think Illinois maybe jumps off the page as another state that's like that you need approval for your visitors. But again, you have to document and have a complete visitor log with the name, the company affiliation of the visitors, the date, time, and purpose of the visit, and the log has to be submitted to the department at least 24 hours in advance of any visit. One thing that drives me nuts on visitor logs is when people put the name as like Casey, and it's, well, Casey who? Visitor logs should be complete. Make sure you're logging in and out. The dates and times that people are going to be there are so important, particularly if you ever have to go back on an investigation, you need to know what time they left. Independent contractors need to be registered as employees. We have a definition of employees, which is, any person who's not a backer, but is a member of the board of a company with ownership interest in the cannabis establishment, any person employed by a cannabis establishment or otherwise has access to such establishment or vehicles, including but not limited to an independent contractor who has routine access to the premises of such establishment or to cannabis handled by such establishment. So independent contractor with routine access, they do need to register as an employee.
And just to jump in there, that or is extremely important, and independent contractor, included but not limited to, really fun lawyer language. If you have consultants that are coming in, if you have a managed services agreement, if you have anyone that's coming in more than the one-off, you need to read this definition very carefully and make sure that they're registered as employees. This is something that DCP is noticing. There's a lot of bodies coming in and out, and how most people use the definition of employee wouldn't encompass this portion of it, but based upon this, and this isn't our definition, the statutory definition, it does have or otherwise has access. So you just want to make sure you know who's coming in. Are they a visitor or are they technically an employee? If they're an employee, making sure they're registered properly with DCP.
Yep. You want to make sure, any necessary background checks are submitted in a timely fashion. And maintaining a drug-free workplace. Now, drug-free workplace is commonplace in, most industries and businesses, but you need to maintain that. Violations for not maintaining that, are sufficient and may result in termination of an employee. Just keep in mind, your employees have to be well aware, you cannot consume on site, you cannot be consuming in your vehicle. Make sure it is very clear what your drug-free workplace policy is and strict adherence to it. Not a slap on the wrist type of situation. Next slide. Access control records. I kind of leaned into this in a couple slides ago, but, for producers, cultivators, micro cultivators, product manufacturer, food and beverage manufacturer, and packagers, the PNPs explicitly call out that you're required to have a log of each instance an employee accesses a restricted area. If it's an electronic access control, that log is much easier to maintain. The one thing I have to say about electronic access control is you want to make sure you're implementing what I call like a no tailgating policy, because if I open the door with my badge and Michelle's right behind me and I hold the door for her, now I don't have a log of each instance that the employee accessed the area because Michelle didn't tap her badge. She just followed me into the space. So make sure everybody's well aware in your facility, you've got to tap the badge because this is how we're creating this log. Inventory requirements. There's a reconciliation of physical inventory with the CAT system, BioTrack, every 7 days. There's also for the retail, hybrid retail, a point of sale software daily reconciliation. That's really important because particularly on the retail side, your point of sale software daily reconciliation, just make sure that, your point of sale system reflects CATs. Then every 7 days, you're able to go ahead and count your physical inventory to compare that. You don't want to let it go beyond this point. You've got to make sure you're actually doing it and documenting it and addressing any discrepancies. There's a requirement that if you cannot determine within 3 days what the cause of the discrepancy is, you do need to report to DCP. If it is diversion, that's immediate, no question, you've got to report it. But you do need to address discrepancies right away. You should not be months in and have a discrepancy that you have not resolved from something that happened, within the weekly reconciliations and audits. And document that you're doing this, document that you did the inventory. If you do a reconciliation, use a reconciliation report to show when DCP comes in and asks any questions, here you go, we've done them all, we resolved any discrepancies within 3 days, as you can see, or we notified you. System outages, you need to notify regarding, the date and time any access was lost to your security systems. You need to notify as soon as possible, but no later than the end of business. So keep an eye on any of your security systems. In other states, it may not be quite as strict on the notification requirements of the system outages, including like a camera outage. The PMPs again say notify the department as soon as possible, but no later than the end of business.
And just to jump in while we're switching slides on the inventory requirements, I know a lot of these requirements, it's one thing to do something, it's another thing to have the documentation to prove that you did something. So you really, oh, sorry, I'm stealing your thunder. It's probably what's coming, but want to make sure anything you're doing is documented, for internal purposes, for external, for DCP. You don't want to say I did this because no one's, you seem very trustworthy, but no one's going to believe you. They're going to want to see the proof that you did it. So record keeping, I'm sure we'll touch on in a little bit, but just wanted to say it as often and as frequently as possible.
Yeah, this is some of the record keeping requirements, regarding training records, for example. But as Michelle's saying, I vehemently, stand by the proof is in the pudding. And if you have nothing to show me, then you could tell me till you're blue in the face, you did it 7 days ago, but I'm seeing that this has been discrepant for a month. So you didn't comply with one piece of this one way or another. So documentation is absolutely key. Documenting that you notified as well, making sure you have a clear record. And as we kind of talked about before, there's turnover. DCP could have questions about something that happened a year ago. You should have those records. When it comes to training records, you have to have 2 hours of CATS training for all users, BioTrack in Connecticut, for all users. You should have that documented. You need to train on security and on the job training. Now, the actual training needs to be documented in a certain way as well. It has to include the names and signatures of the trainee and the training supervisor, the dates of the training, and a general description of the topics covered. So, I find that a lot of operators don't necessarily think or document all the on-the-job training. If you have a team meeting and you're going through and teaching them a particular function or a new policy that you're putting in place to avoid discrepancies, that is on the job training and you should be documenting it accordingly. There's also significant notification requirements in Connecticut. The designated key employee actually has to provide DCP with notifications. There's your key employees and then there's your designated key employee. That designated key employee is who is providing the notifications to DCP. You can imagine why. It's actually, it was good thinking on DCP's part here to say, I can't be having these notifications coming from 5 different people from a licensee. There should be a designated key employee where information kind of funnels through to them. You obviously need to notify for change in ownership, name, change of location, modification to a facility, which requires approval. Some of these, actually, all of these will require DCP approval. So it's not just a notification, it's actual approval for that. Key employee changes, if you have a key employee, they leave the facility, they're no longer associated, not more than 15 days, you have to notify the DCP that has changed. If an employer or backer is no longer associated, within 5 days, notify DCP. Closure, there's, go through the PNPs if you're closing, whether it's temporary, whether it's long-term, again, notification requirement. As you can kind of tell, we've said it a million times, but be completely transparent with your DCP agent. Talk to them. They're nothing but supportive. They want you to, be compliant, and stay open. So certainly, be transparent about what's going on and ask the questions. Reportable events, there are quite a few reportable events that, you need to notify DCP about, and within a certain time frame, largely around security, diversion, alarm activations, and you just need to know and make sure that your team is trained on, and definitely a designated key employee, when that notification has to go through, and who's responsible for that. So we know the designated key employee would provide the notification for DCP, but everyone that operates in the day-to-day should know something like, oh, it was just a false alarm, the police came, it was no big deal. Well, an alarm activation that requires public safety response is a reportable event. So again, that trickle down on training and making sure, top down, bottom up, everybody is well aware of what the notification requirements are and what their role is in compliance with those requirements.
In the phone tree, you got to make sure they know when to activate it.
That's right. All right, next slide. All right, so testing. Obviously, products need to be tested by approved testing lab. As of right now, Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's only one testing lab that's approved right now.
But the new law does provide a clearer framework to getting more labs licensed, and I hear there's been some strong interest. I haven't heard if that's turned yet into any applications going in, but certainly aware of the bottleneck and that one lab will not be sufficient to support the market. So I know it's a priority to get more up and running.
Great, love that. Now, when you send in a test sample, these are just high level big points we wanted to talk about. Was the isolated batch, or what was left, right? I send the sample out, but there's going to be the rest of the batch left. I'm calling it the isolated batch. It has to be withheld from use in its entirety. That means different things for different people, but to be clear, it cannot be used. The rest of the batch has to sit there and wait for the test results. Stability testing. This is something new, right? New for DCP, new for the medical operators. DCP is working through it with us. We're gonna, the licensees, again, just need to be aware that stability testing is required. It's performed on each specific type and size of final packaging. For the first batch in each product category produced by the cannabis establishment in the end user form. So it was like, an edible, it's the edible form, not the distillate. The first batch of each brand of cannabis beverage and edible product, it's tested in final packaging. Think about that a little bit like vape cartridges. If anyone's familiar with Massachusetts, one of the requirements is that you actually have to send the sample in the vape cartridge because they're going to be testing for leaching and heavy metals. Similar, understanding here. And that the stability testing is done at intervals of 30 and 60 days with samples that are set aside prior to the application for brand registration for the batch.
And I just wanted to flag, like I said, we're on 5th edition of PNPs. The stability testing is new, and this is the area we've seen tweaks to the language over the course of the year. And I will say, if you have a concern, if you are struggling on the operator side, if you're trying to do something, it's just not working financially, technically, reach out to DCP, let them know if something is working or not working. Most people reach out when it's not working, and they're not reaching out to say, oh my God, I love this. This is amazing. But, we have seen iterations of this where they are making change based upon operator feedback. They're learning, they're borrowing language from other markets. A lot of the packaging and labeling coming from Jersey. So if there's something that isn't working, please let them know. I would say do it in a respectful tone and back it up with some type of, facts, logic, anything to bolster your case rather than just complaining and whining that something is costing you money, but explaining why and how and really breaking it down. I've found DCP to be reasonable to hear you out. They might not make the change tomorrow and say, oh my God, thanks for bringing this to my attention. But now is the time while we're in PNP phase. Once we move to regulations, a lot harder to make changes. So now is when we're working out all the kinks in the experiment. So if anything, particularly on the stability testing side, but really on any side, any area, communicate with DCP. And then if you have questions on any of this, reach out. I would caution against, shopping around questions and answers. Your agent will let you know if you're going through the build out stage, what type of questions can come to them. Once you're operational, you'll know who to go to, what to do. And short of that, and you're new and fresh and have no idea who to go to, use the DCP Cannabis licensing email address. They're still aggregating all the questions. That's how they know when they get to a tipping point, when they need to update the FAQs, or when it's a tipping point. Oh yeah, it sounds like enough people have an issue on this topic. We should examine this topic. But try not to email 4 different individuals because you didn't like the answer you got from one, hoping you'll get answers from others. As a former regulator, I can tell you that's really annoys us, and don't do that. All right, next slide.
All right, brand registration. Brand registration, it's $25 fee per brand name. You have the brand registration application. You have to include the brand name as it's going to appear on the product, including the exact copy of the label, the complete lab report from, again, the licensed lab, which right now we're only at 1, but cross fingers, we're going to get some more. And also right now in the brand registration application, it's not explicitly called out, but the policies and procedures do require all information concerning ingredients, processing techniques, and solvents to be included in the brand registration application. So that's what you're getting into when you're actually going to register your brand. Oh, next slide. DCP will not register any brand. I'm not going to read through all of these, but most importantly, what we see and what I would say is pretty common on brand registration is if it is attractive to minors. And, somewhat of a subjective analysis, but also, you really want to go about determining and looking at your packaging as a whole. Is this attractive to minors? Is it, is there something about like the font? Is it, a color issue? Is it a naming issue? Is it, something about the product that is either attractive to minors or similar to a brand that is associated with somebody under 21. If you haven't yet and you're coming up with, a particular product or brand name, Google it and see what comes up, or, Bing or whatever you may use. What comes up? Is it something that's attractive to a minor? Is it something that's commonly associated? Is it a cartoon? Is it a cartoon? Is it a show on Nickelodeon? Like, those are the things you want to make sure you're vetting out first, because DCP is not going to register brands that fall into any of the categories you see on here.
And Connecticut has a number of data sets available for you to creep, for lack of a better word. Obviously, a lot of statistics there, but also just generally. And brand registration is one where this information is publicly available. So if you wanted to go through and look through what's been registered to date, what the labels are, that information is available. And then another point with brand registration, it says it right there when you go to register. They're not, the state's not performing a label review as part of this brand registration. Well, you have to upload a label. That's not their responsibility, their job. They expressly disclaim they're looking at it, but not in terms of is the label compliant. So just something to know, even if you're successful in getting the brand registered, you can't then hide behind that and say, great, that means my label's perfect. That is not something that is going to be captured. And I did just see a question pop in. You do need to be a licensee in order to be registering the brand. So just to flag that. All right, so we are surprisingly running out of time. So we'll go pretty quick here towards the end, a couple of slides. So some staffing considerations. Based upon what we're seeing and hearing, just a reminder to all hybrid retailers, obviously to the dispensaries as well, pharmacists do need to be there during the hours of operation, as well as a key employee. A pharmacist can be your key employee, but you want to make sure you're familiar within the PNPs and the laws who needs to be on site, and confirming they are on site, and confirming them in the sense that you can document it, whether it's their electronic access, sign in, sign out, somehow proving, if there's ever an issue, something went wrong, making sure you actually have the staff that's required to be on site at the time they're required to be on site. And then just a note here on the hybrid retail, if you are continuing with dispensary techs, this is not a note for retail, not a note for dispensary, narrow advice here on the hybrid retail. If you do choose to have dispensary techs, you do need to maintain that ratio that is required. But take a look at the DCP FAQs on the website. You're not required to maintain dispensary techs. You might get a different quality of service and employee, but if you choose to have dispensary techs, make sure you maintain those ratios that are required. Next slide. All right. I think let's skip this one. You have it in your slide deck, which will be sent out at the end, but number of responsibilities of who your key employees are. You don't need to have one, think as you're thinking through staffing, make sure you understand, vacation, sickness, illness. You don't want to be in a position that you're like, great, I'm hiring, I have one pharmacist. Cool, what if they quit? What if they're sick? You need to make sure you think through and understand what all these definitions mean, make sure everyone's registered, make sure you have your roster set up. So, worst case scenario, you don't need to shut your doors down if someone calls in sick or is unavailable. You have a deep enough bench to pull from, and make sure your hours are accordingly. All right, let's go to next slide. All right, just some hot tips here at the end, just to based upon things that we're seeing, / we had no idea where to put them in the slide deck, so we're just adding them to the end as hot tips. A flag. So we've had PNPs, 5 versions, as I keep saying. Hopefully I counted right. I think I can count to 5. And what we saw over the June legislative session, a lot of the packaging and labeling requirements are now codified in law. So I mentioned you can make some changes to the PNPs before their regulations. Note, if it's in law, not to say you can't make the changes, but it's going to be a lot harder to undo legislative acts than it is regulations or policies and procedures or FAQs. So take a look at those, understand as you're entering this market, designing products, building up what essentially you're stuck with for now. Obviously, legislative sessions back in January, but it might be hard to undo what's already been done. So just a note there. If Casey, you want to do the second bullet there.
Yeah. So if you are, a food and beverage licensee or manufacturer, mostly food and beverage licensee, obviously, there may be additional licenses, or there are additional licenses required to be issued by DCP. So you want to take a look at the DCP food standards. There's a link right there to food licensing and registration. Think about what you're making. Like, for example, you may need a bakery license if you're creating a particular type of product. You may need, I think it's called like a non-alcohol beverage producer license if you're creating a beverage. So there are all different types of licenses that are additionally required to be issued by DCP. And this will effectively, or should effectively, hold up your operations, or could hold up your operations, should you not have those licenses at the time you're ready to produce those products, or more importantly, distribute those products.
Yeah, and this could be, DCP licenses, local boards of health, obviously cannabis licensing, regulatory, extremely important framework to follow. Other laws do still apply to you, even if you're in the cannabis sector, environmental laws, like I said, local board of health, food standards. So make sure you understand, the full gamut of what you're trying to do. And I'd also say, just because everyone else might not have, e-license is great. You can, as I said, look up a lot of information. Just because maybe other people are making a brownie in the industry and doesn't have the license, that doesn't mean the license is not required. It means you can lead and show people what licenses are required. So make sure you familiarize yourself based upon what you're looking to produce and make, that you have all the required licenses that are needed. And then I think we said before, right now, be patient on the laboratory, work out a timeline for yourself about how long something's going to take from, conception to, out the door. Whether you're on the manufacturing side, retail, or product ordering, make sure you're aware of what needs to get done. And then, back to the PNPs, reading things carefully, make sure if you have any questions, reach out, ask the question. Language in the PNPs right now that seems to be confusing people, language about whether the certificate of analysis is a product expiration date or it just means the COA needs to be created within a certain amount of time. So I just would like to caution COAs need to be created within 30 days, but that it doesn't mean the product expires within 30 days. All right, next slide. All right, we got through it quickly. Obviously, a lot more to cover. We didn't quite have visibility into who'd be attending, what stage of the build out, final license perspective. So if there's particular questions, topics for next time, anything, we were hoping to do this in a series. This is kind of just one of the overlays of the first one. So feel free to reach out to either of us with any other questions you might have. And I know we didn't have time to get to questions. We're already a minute over, so apologies, but feel free to reach out directly to one of us to provide information. And these slides will get sent out in advance and posted on YouTube if you want to watch it over and over again. But these are email address. We'd love to talk to you and hope to see everyone at the next event in the state.